Greetings to all of you watching from home or at work. It's a great honor to join you here today at the GP 2022 Ignite stage. My name is Kristen Downs, and I'm a PhD candidate in Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the University of North Carolina. I represent our partners at the UNC Water Institute, the Re-Energize DR3 project, and the Scientific and Technology Major Group, which is convened by the International Science Council. In December 2020, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, spoke on the state of the planet. He mentioned vulnerability 5 times in a 28-minute speech. In one of these instances, he said, "As always, the impacts fall most heavily on the world's most vulnerable people. Those who have done the least to cause the problem are suffering the most. Even in the developed world, the marginalized are the first victims of disasters and the last to recover." Dear friends, let's be clear. Human activities are the root of our descent towards chaos, but that means human action can help solve it. The motivating question behind my presentation is the following. How should we address disaster vulnerability at the regional and global levels in a way that also informs the local levels? I don't have the answers, but I do want to share with you a proposal for your consideration. I am part of Re-Energize DR3, a Belmont Forum funded project to take collaborative research action on disaster risk reduction and resilience. We're funded by 4 national science research foundations across the world. Our research is focused on the governance of disaster risk reduction and resilience, with an emphasis on floods, drought, and heat waves in coastal cities and islands. Our collaboration spans 7 nations on the continents of Europe, Africa, Asia, and North America, with researchers from multiple disciplines across the world, led by the University of College London. The US team of Re-Energize DR3 has been studying the governance of disasters in the US at the federal, state, and local levels, using the state of North Carolina as a case study. In our research and stakeholder engagement workshops, we were really excited to learn about a multidimensional vulnerability index under development for SIDS, but surprised to learn that there, as yet, isn't a UN member state agreed universal or global vulnerability index. This finding raises the need for a broader and more coherent approach to vulnerability indices. Recognizing the enormity of the scope and importance of this challenge, we partnered with the International Science Council, who convened the Science and Technology Major Group. As part of this collaboration, the ISC is bringing this subject to the Ignite stage at the UNDRR GP 2022, where we are today. Given that vulnerability is being discussed in different UN forums, we're concerned that the present lack of coordination across the UN may create confusion and not adequately address the needs of the most vulnerable populations if these efforts are not unified. ISC is contributing a piece of the puzzle towards a solution by engaging academics and practitioners to look for a path forward that can complement the UN processes. Next, we plan to go to the Bonn Climate Change Conference to once again speak about the need for coordination. The story will be continued, but its next turns will depend on the feedback we get. We'll see where the journey takes us. We're here to try and see whether there's a way to develop vulnerability indices through a regional process that informs local action for vulnerable groups. Now, let me tell you a story. In December 2020, the UN General Assembly called upon the Secretary General to make recommendations for the development, coordination, and potential use of a multidimensional vulnerability index for small island developing states. How did we get to this point? Let me take you back to the early 2000s. Originally designed in 2000 and subsequently revised in 2005, the Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index, or EVI, is one of the earliest vulnerability indices used at the regional and global level. Since 2005, the EVI has served as one of 3 criteria that the UN Committee for Development Policy, or UNCDP, uses to identify and graduate from the least developed countries, or LDCs. Currently consists of 2 dimensions of vulnerability, economic and environmental, and 8 indicators developed from an agreed upon methodology that's reviewed every 3 years. One of its major strengths is that its data covers 143 countries back to the year 2000. Now let's jump forward in time. In February 2021, in response to the call for a multidimensional vulnerability index for SIDS, Jacob Assa and Riyad Medeb of UNDP developed an excellent report in which they propose an expanded MVI that builds upon the EVI. The UNDP MVI includes 11 indicators from the EVI and the World Bank. The indicators represent 4 dimensions of vulnerability: economic, financial, environmental, and geographic. While this MVI has been focused on small island developing states, its indicators may be globally applicable, and it includes data that covers 126 countries. I encourage you to seek out their work to learn more details. The UNDP MVI includes 3 economic indicators from the EVI: merchandise export concentration, the instability of agricultural production, and the instability of exported goods and services. It adds 3 financial indicators from the World Bank relating to international tourism, personal remittances, and foreign direct investment. The 3 geographic indicators include remoteness and landlockedness, and the shares of population in both dry lands and low elevated coastal zones. Finally, 2 environmental indicators are the share of agriculture in GDP and victims of disasters. Additionally, there's been some interesting work on the MVI front from the UNOHRLLS that we were excited to learn about. We also highly recommend taking a look at their December 2021 report, which includes an expanded review of existing MVIs and recommendations for criteria on the development of an MVI for SIDS. Specifically, their proposed MVI links vulnerability and resilience together using dimensions of structural vulnerability and structural and policy resilience, which we think is particularly promising. So far, we've been looking at vulnerability indices at the national and regional level. We've seen examples of economic, financial, geographic, and environmental vulnerability indicators. If we're going to develop a more comprehensive set of vulnerability indices, we also need to look more closely at and involve a broader range of groups of people who are vulnerable. UNICEF has started to look at this for children. In 2021, UNICEF proposed the Children's Climate Risk Index, or CCRI, whose indicators are separated into 2 pillars. Pillar 1 is the exposure to climate and environmental shocks and stresses, which includes a number of indicators that I'm sure you're familiar with. Pillar 2 is child vulnerability. This set of indicators includes poverty, communication assets and social protection, water, sanitation and hygiene, education, and child health and nutrition. At this point in the story, we've established a broad understanding of the existing approaches for capturing vulnerability. Though this provides a good starting point for efforts moving forward, we're still worried about the process being disjointed. As I mentioned earlier, the discussion on vulnerability is happening all over the UN system in parallel and not yet in concert. And there are many things that may be missing from this discussion, but one important gap is the dimension of peace and security. As the COP27 presidency emphasized, the peace and security aspect would be critical in a vulnerability index, especially in the context of Africa. It may also be relevant to Eastern Europe now. In general, we believe indicators need to be customized by region to capture local dimensions and reflect the needs of local vulnerable populations. A coordinated and coherent process is critical to take advantage of the existing work and momentum and to prevent further fragmentation. We're very excited about the important groundwork that's being undertaken by the institutions we've mentioned. We recognize the vision for an expanded set of vulnerability indices is bigger than any single institution can do. Through the ISC, we want to create a space for stakeholders to join the conversations across these different fora. We invite researchers, practitioners, and stakeholders with a breadth of knowledge and experience to join and take this idea forward. We hope the input can contribute to and complement UN processes in a more coordinated and clearer way. We see a window of opportunity, and we believe now is the time to seize it. With that in mind, we'd like to raise some questions we think would need to be addressed in such a process. First, which dimensions of vulnerability should be considered? You've heard some of these already, but there may be more. Second, what data sources do we have, do we need, and may be regionally specific? Third, how can benchmarking and peer review help countries to share their approaches and to learn from one another? For example, benchmarking could be used by countries facing similar challenges and in similar levels of development. Learning and exchange between countries could also be supported by peer review of one another's vulnerability indices as they are being developed. Fourth, how can this process ensure vulnerability indices for particular groups, such as UNICEF's CCRI for children, are integrated into the regional and global processes? Fifth, how can this process ensure the inclusion of all vulnerable groups? This may be the most important question. Finally, how could this process help identify policies and approaches that can build resilience in communities and to support vulnerable groups in particular? As we look down the potential path to expanding the regional vulnerability indices, we have some hopes. Whether or not they end up aggregated into a global framework, we hope that a regional approach could take advantage of stakeholder engagement, particularly of vulnerable groups, and the unique elements of each region, while engaging in a coherent way with the UN system as a whole. We also hope that the regional vulnerability indices would be completed in time for the 2027 review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes the Sustainable Development Goals, and then the review of the Sustainable Development Indicators in 2028, which will be agreed upon by the UN Statistical Commission. What are the next steps for us? We plan to have side events to share this idea at the following conferences this year, starting with the Bonn Climate Change Conference in June and culminating with the Resilience Hub at COP27. What might your next steps be? We highly encourage you to engage with us and with others, and most importantly, where vulnerability is relevant, which is everywhere. Karima Kasi, and thank you. Listed on the slide are my and Felix Dodds' emails. Please do contact us if you're interested in chatting or getting involved.